The Cold War and nuclear meltdown. For most of us, what immediately springs to mind is Chernobyl or possibly 3 Mile Island. But what if I told you that these weren't the first nuclear disasters? Some of you might be thinking of Windscale or even SL1. But before all of those came Kyshtym. The 1957 Kyshtym disaster is recognized as the world's first major nuclear disaster and ranks third in severity behind only the Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi disasters. And yet, despite this, it's a largely unknown event. So today, grab your Rad-X as we're going to talk about Kyshtym, the Cold War, and why you've likely never even heard of it. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. The end of the Second World War saw a large gap in the nuclear capabilities of the United States and the Soviet Union. Namely, that the United States had atomic weapons and the Soviet Union didn't. Stalin felt that this situation was untenable, especially given the post-war strategic tensions that were developing between Moscow and Washington, D.C. As such, the Soviet Union embarked on an accelerated nuclear program to develop their own atomic weapon. Of course, this was only an acceleration of a program that was already in place. On April 9, 1945, the Soviet government had already made the decision to build plant number 817 in Chelyabinsk Oblast in the Ural Mountains. This plant would be dedicated to the construction of the Soviet atomic bomb. Construction was begun immediately, and by 1948, the Mayak nuclear reactor was complete. The plant itself covered an approximate area of 90 square kilometers and was surrounded by a 250 square kilometer exclusion zone in order to maintain the secrecy of the project. The secret town that was built for the plant, now called Ozersk, was originally named Chelyabinsk 40, and by January 1949, the reactor was producing weapons-grade uranium and plutonium, and a month later, production of the nuclear weapons themselves was commenced. Now, about the construction of the plant, the town, and the reactor. Much of the construction was carried out by over 40,000 prisoners from Gulag or Axis prisoner of war camps. Don't forget that the POWs were being used by the Soviets as part of ongoing reparations claims against their defeated enemies in the Second World War. The use of this labor, however, created several problems which eventually compromised the security of the site. The first was the speed at which the project was undertaken. Since the Soviets were in such a hurry to catch up to the United States nuclear program, many security and safety precautions in the construction projects themselves were either overlooked or just ignored. The other major problem lay in the lack of in-depth knowledge regarding nuclear science. To be fair, this was a brand new field of research, and there were many unknowns, but the combination of unknowns with breakneck speed in construction was creating a recipe for disaster. And I can hear you already asking, David, can you tell us more specifically where the problems were? Well, yes, I can. The two biggest problem areas lay with the inadequate attention paid to cooling systems on site, as well as with how radioactive waste was being handled. For anybody who knows anything about how reactors work, these are two critical factors in safe operation. Failures in these areas are how disasters occur. Yeah, that's a spoiler. Let's take a look at the waste management issues first. Well, to begin with, when the plant was first brought online, the issue of waste was largely ignored. High-level radioactive waste was being dumped directly into the nearby Techa River, a tributary of the Ob River, which then flowed down to the Arctic Ocean. Eventually, this practice was halted and the waste was being collected. Of course, the devil being in the details, the waste was collected and dumped into Lake Karachay, close to Lake Kiziltush, on which all 6 reactors at Chelyabinsk 40 were built. Lake Karachay became less of a lake and instead became a radioactive waste dump. By 1953, an enclosed storage facility for liquid radioactive waste was constructed, in at least a vague effort to decrease the extreme environmental impact the waste was having on the region. Keep in mind, not only was the town of Chelyabinsk 40 built on the shores of these lakes, but the Techa River was the main source of drinking water for more than 20 surrounding villages. The waste was poisoning the people as well as the entire ecology that depended on the techa for survival, so it's a good thing that the waste collection facility was built, right? Now that you've already got an idea of what is coming, we should probably point out that the Mayak complex had suffered from some smaller accidents in the early to mid-1950s, although these were relatively small and locally contained. In 1953, a radiation leak injured some of the reactor workers, and in 1955, a rupture in some equipment partially destroyed one of the processing buildings. So, for a site that was only a few years old, not a great safety track record. But these incidents would prove to be minor relative to what happened on the 29th of September, 1957. The collection tanks themselves were large steel tanks mounted on concrete, sunk approximately 8 meters into the ground. The cooling system for one of the radioactive waste collection tanks, holding between 70 to 80 tons of radioactive liquid, had been malfunctioning for some time, leading up to the 29th, but it had been ignored and left unrepaired. As you probably are aware, one of the byproducts of radioactive material is heat. As the heat increased, the liquid in the tank evaporated, leaving behind a radioactive mix of ammonium nitrate mixed with acetates. These are the base components for an ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb, sometimes referred to as a fertilizer bomb. As the temperature in the tank increased, the chances of disaster increased with it. On the 29th, it happened. The tank exploded with the force of approximately 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The lid of the tank, 160 tons of concrete, was blown free, and although this itself didn't cause any casualties, the consequences for the surrounding area were devastating, as 20 megacuries of radioactivity were released across the region. Steps were taken almost immediately after the blast occurred to try and mitigate the scope of the disaster. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians were mobilized to try and help clean up. However, in a move that would be repeated in 1986, these people often weren't given any special gear or protection. Evacuations did begin almost immediately as well, but some of you may find the order in which these happened to be quite interesting. First, non-essential military units as well as prison inmates in the region were evacuated, followed by production staff at Mayak. Only after 7 days since the explosion had passed was the civilian population informed as forced evacuations began. There were approximately 270,000 people living in 217 towns, villages, and settlements across the impacted oblasts of Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Tyumen. Of these towns, villages, and settlements, 23 of them, made up of about 10,000 people, were evacuated until 1960. Across the region, buildings, animals, belongings, livestock, and agricultural production were all burned and then buried in order to control the radiation. For any of you who have watched HBO's excellent TV series Chernobyl, this might all seem eerily familiar. Those evacuated were compensated for their relocation, including for their destroyed belongings. Now, one of the primary goals in the period following the explosion was to try and contain the spread of radioactive material. In order to aid this, an exclusion zone was created in the affected areas, preventing anybody from living or working there, including fishing or agriculture. This exclusion zone was maintained and enforced by the Soviet police, the militia, and to this day remains a closed nature reserve under the control of the State Atomic Energy Corporation, Rosatom. So, what were the effects of the Kyshtym disaster? Well, from an economic perspective, they were devastating. 54% of agricultural land in the area was made unusable, as well as huge swaths of forest and bodies of water. For a region that relied on both agriculture and primary resource extraction for work, the impact was enormous. As for the human lives, there were no actual direct fatalities from the explosion. But, since there's always a but, there are estimates that up to 90,000 people in the region suffered from some form of radiation poisoning or radiation-related illnesses, most notably forms of cancer, in the years that followed the explosion. For context, from a population of 270,000, that's 1 in every 3 people. I mentioned at the start that Kyshtym is ranked as the 3rd most severe nuclear disaster to date, after Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi. On the International Nuclear Event Scale, or INES, Measured on a scale from 0 to 7, Kyshtym has been ranked a level 6, a serious accident, described as a significant release of radioactive material likely to require implementation of planned countermeasures. So it's clearly a significant event in nuclear history, but why don't more people know about it? Well, we can thank the Cold War for that. The Soviet Union, as a closed country and secretive about its nuclear program at the absolute best of times, did everything it could to conceal the disaster. Cover stories were created to explain events and divert attention from the area. For example, a week after the explosion, the Chelyabinsk Rabochi newspaper ran an article explaining that the orange-red color in the sky from rising dust was the effects of the northern lights, the aurora borealis. Aurora borealis? At this time of year? At this time of day? In this part of the country? Localized entirely within your exclusion zone? Yes. Okay, now this is the reaction that we would expect from the Soviet Union. Cover it up. But what did the rest of the world know about Kyshtym? A fair bit, actually. The United States government, as you might expect, knew about the disaster from the extensive use of atmospheric radiation measuring equipment that had been deployed as part of their monitoring of the Soviet nuclear program. And yet, despite knowing about the disaster, they didn't take the opportunity to embarrass the Soviets on the international stage. This choice was made since they knew the scale of public outcry that would be created at home about the Americans' own nuclear program. As a quick aside regarding the American knowledge of the Kyshtym disaster, it's been suggested that the reconnaissance mission that Gary Powers was on in his U-2 plane when he was shot down in 1960 was to get footage of the area around Mayak. But we'll talk more about that when we get to Gary Powers. Now, this wasn't to say that there was no public knowledge of the 1957 explosion in the West. By the late 1950s, there were scattered articles and reports about a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union. As early as 1958, a Danish newspaper had reported on the disaster. It wasn't until 1978, however, that Kyshtym was confirmed by Soviet sources. This came from accounts of an exiled Soviet dissident, Zhores Medvedev, who published information in the British journal New Scientist. Medvedev's accounts were subsequently corroborated by another Soviet exile, Lev Tumerman. Tumerman wrote in the Jerusalem Post that, quote, "About 100 kilometers from Sverdlovsk, a highway sign warned drivers not to stop for the next 20 or 30 kilometers and to drive through at maximum speed. On both sides of the road, as far as one could see, was dead. No villages, no towns, only the chimneys of destroyed houses. No cultivated fields or pastures, no herds, no people, nothing." It took until 1989 for official recognition of the disaster by the Soviet Union at the height of perestroika, when the Supreme Soviet acknowledged the Kyshtym disaster. Finally, we should ask what the legacy of Kyshtym is. Clearly, the fact that both major nuclear powers of the time decided to cover up the incident, despite different motivations for doing so, is telling. The Soviet Union feared the public black eye that they would suffer from the disaster. The United States feared the backlash and outcry that their own nuclear programs might suffer, clearly realizing how important nuclear armaments were for their own security doctrine. In hindsight, we can also see that the Soviet Union did not learn from Kyshtym, as less than 30 years later, another major nuclear incident occurred in the Soviet Union, one which came with massive social and economic upheaval, which some have suggested led to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Now, that being said, before the comment section explodes with suggestions that totalitarian systems cause these incidents, it is important to remind everybody that other nuclear disasters have occurred in the non-totalitarian West. The common thread behind all of these disasters has always been lax safety protocols and lack of sufficient redundancies to ensure adequate safety for all involved. If we bury the knowledge of our mistakes, it becomes impossible to learn from them. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have a press the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. And we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.